Chapter 7. It came in Abzal's office late one evening, the hope, when the city outside was settling into its slow rhythm and the courthouse lights across the street had already gone dark. Abzal sat behind his desk with his jacket off, sleeves rolled up, phone pressed to his ear. Alexander waited opposite him, fingers wrapped around a cup of Moroccan tea that had long since gone cold. Abzal spoke in low, careful phrases, switching between Kazakh and Russian, choosing his words the way one might choose footing on unstable ground. Alexander watched him closely, reading the pauses more than the sentences. When the call finally ended, Abzal did not smile. He rarely did when something mattered. "There may be a narrow opening," he said. Alexander straightened. "To see Max, to formalize temporary contact," Abzal replied. "Not custody, though. A provisional agreement allowing scheduled meetings while proceedings continue." Alexander nodded immediately. "I don't care how limited." Abzal leaned back, folding his hands. "A mediator within the court administration has agreed to review the petition again. It will be framed as a conflict reduction measure for the stability of the child." "And Layla?" Alexander asked. "She will oppose it," Abzal said, "but refusing outright would make her appear uncooperative, especially after the court encouraged mediation." "So this could actually happen," Alexander said carefully. "It could," Abzal replied, "which is why you must be cautious." That night, Alexander walked home instead of taking a car. He needed to think. The streets were busy enough to offer anonymity, but calm enough for patterns to emerge. Halfway down the block, he noticed the same dark sedan he had seen earlier that week, idling with its lights off. It pulled away the moment he looked directly at it. Over the following days, the watching stopped being subtle. At first, Alexander told himself it was a coincidence. The same dark sedan idling across the street when he left his apartment, a man pretending to scroll on his phone outside the cafe where he stopped every morning, a pair of unfamiliar faces seated near him in the back row of the courthouse corridor. Almaty was not small, but it wasn't anonymous either. He could see the patterns formed quickly, and Alexander, trained to notice systems, noticed repetition. By the fourth day, it became harder to dismiss. When he changed his routine, took a longer route back from Abzal's office, entered a convenience store he had never visited before, someone always appeared a few minutes later. Not always the same person, but he could tell he was being watched. That was the part that unsettled him most. Whoever was doing this understood rotation, understood how to avoid becoming obvious by never repeating the same face twice in a row. It wasn't amateur surveillance. It was deliberate, measured, and patient. At night, it got worse. Headlights lingered longer than necessary beneath his windows. He could hear footsteps echoing in the stairwell and stopped just outside his door, only to move away again. There were no threats, no confrontation, just presence and invisible pressure building up, meant to exhaust rather than scare. When Alexander finally told Abzal everything, the lawyer didn't interrupt. He listened carefully, asked precise questions, times, locations, descriptions, then leaned back in his chair, his expression tightening. "This isn't about intimidation yet," Abzal said quietly. "This is about conditioning. They want you alert, tired, uncertain. They want you to start doubting your own reactions." He paused. "And that's exactly why you need to report it." "Report what?" "You report the pattern," Abzal replied. "You create a record, mention dates, places, behavior, and faces you recognize. You make it visible even if they pretend not to see it." His voice dropped slightly. "And you do it now, before they decide watching isn't enough." Abzal nodded grimly again. "Progress attracts attention, especially progress that disrupts comfortable arrangements." Alexander hesitated. "I think I'm in danger." Abzal did not dismiss the idea. "Yes, we must document it immediately." They went to the police station together. Alexander explained the surveillance, the escalation, the timing. He asked formally for protective measures. The officers listened with a practiced stillness that gave Alexander brief hope. One of them took notes, asking him to repeat dates and locations, requesting descriptions of the men and vehicles he had seen. Another typed steadily into a terminal, nodding at intervals as if the system itself were absorbing his fear. When Alexander finished, there was a pause long enough to feel considered, then the questions shifted. Had anyone threatened him directly, touched him, damaged his property again? When he said no, the tone changed subtly, the urgency draining from the room. What he was describing, the officer explained, could not yet be classified as a crime. They told him they would open an informational report, not an investigation, just a record. The words were careful, almost soothing. One officer explained that Almaty was a busy city, that unfamiliar faces and repeated sightings were common, especially for foreigners under stress. Surveillance, unless proven, remained an assumption. Still, they said, his concerns would be logged, patrol units informed, and he should call immediately if anything escalated. The phrase was repeated twice, if anything happens. Until then, there was little they could formally act on. When Alexander asked about the break-in, the phone call, the warning, the officers exchanged a glance before answering. The apartment incident was already documented, they said, and since nothing was taken, it remained unresolved but inactive. As for the call, they could request a trace through proper channels, but that process required time and cooperation from the authorities, and even then, results were not guaranteed. In the meantime, they advised him to avoid unnecessary movement, remain reachable, and not provoke tensions related to his ongoing family dispute. It was said gently, almost kindly, but the implication was clear that whatever was happening to him existed at the edges of concern, not at its center. The following afternoon, Abzal received a call. When he asked what the meeting concerned, the reply was carefully noncommittal, a few clarifications related to a foreign national currently involved in a family dispute. The wording alone told him more than the speaker intended. After the call ended, Abzal remained seated, phone still in his hand, replaying the possibilities. He knew immediately what it meant. Meetings like this were rarely about information, they were about negotiations, about reminding people where lines were drawn and who was expected to stay within them. Abzal sighed, rubbing his temple, already weighing what he could say and, more importantly, what he must not. He thought of Alexander, alone in a country that still felt hostile beneath its surface politeness, and felt a flicker of unease he hadn't allowed himself until now. By the time he stood to gather his coat, Abzal understood that whatever the police wanted, it had little to do with resolving a custody issue and everything to do with containing it. They want you to come in tomorrow, he told Alexander, to discuss your concerns. Alexander frowned. Who? A district officer. He didn't give a name. Do you think I should go? Abzal knew with a heaviness that settled in his chest that Alexander would still have to go to the station. No matter what this meeting signaled, avoiding the police would only make things worse for a foreigner already under quiet scrutiny. The system allowed very little space for absence. Abzal thought through the options quickly and found none that truly protected his client, only ones that delayed the inevitable. Whatever was unfolding, Alexander would have to show up, answer questions, stay visible, and hope visibility did not turn into vulnerability. That knowledge lingered with him, the uneasy certainty that the next move was no longer theirs to choose. If you refuse, it can be framed as non-cooperation, Abzal said. If you go carefully, Alexander acquiesced. I'll go. The next morning felt wrong from the start. Abzal had been meant to go with him. They had agreed on it the night before, a brief, unspoken understanding that Alexander should not walk into any official space alone anymore. But early that morning, Abzal called, his voice unusually tight. A senior mediator had summoned him unexpectedly, something about the provisional agreement, something that required his presence immediately. Delaying it, Abzal said, could cost them the narrow opening they had just secured. I don't like this timing, Abzal told him, but if I don't go now, it closes. Alexander hesitated. Should we postpone the station visit? Abzal was silent for a moment. If they asked you to come and you don't, it can be used against you. Go, ask to wait. Don't let them rush you. If anything feels off, leave. I'll be careful, Alexander said. I'll call as soon as I'm done, Abzal replied. You're not alone in this, even if I'm not there. Alexander ended the call with the faint, uneasy feeling that the balance had shifted. He left his apartment early, scanning reflections in windows, tracking movement the way he had learned to do unconsciously over the past weeks. He noticed two vehicles he didn't recognize adjusting speed to match his route. When he changed direction, one continued straight, the other turned with him. At the station, the desk officer directed him down a side corridor. "Second door," she said. "Wait there." The room was bare with just 2 chairs, a desk, and no windows. Alexander waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. He checked his phone, no signal. Alexander sat rigid on one of the chairs, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped so tightly his fingers ached. The holding corridor was windowless, sealed in concrete and fluorescent light, the kind of space meant to drain time of meaning. He checked his phone again, out of habit more than hope. The screen felt useless in his palm, a dead weight. He told himself this was normal, bureaucracy always moved slowly here, but unease crept in all the same. Then he heard footsteps. They weren't casual. They came fast and in singular rhythm, more than one set, shoes striking the floor with purpose. Alexander straightened instinctively, his 95 spine stiffening. The sound stopped just outside the room. For a brief moment, there was silence, deliberate and thick, as if someone were deciding something on the other side of the door. The handle turned, the door opened, and 3 men stepped inside. They were immediately out of place. No uniforms, no badges clipped to belts or hanging from lanyards, just dark street clothes, jackets zipped halfway up, shoulders broad enough to fill the doorway. Their faces were blank in a practiced way, hard eyes, mouth set neutral, movements precise and calculated. They entered without speaking, spreading out slightly so that Alexander was no longer directly aligned with the exit. One of them closed the door behind them, gently, carefully, as if noise itself were unnecessary. Alexander stood slowly. "I'm waiting for my lawyer," he said, keeping his voice measured. "Abzal Qasim's Hanif, he should be here." None of them replied. One man stepped forward. He didn't rush, didn't raise his voice. He simply extended his hand towards Alexandra's arm, palm open, the gesture vague enough to be interpreted as guidance or restraint. He reacted on instinct, twisting sharply to the side. The man's fingers grazed fabric but didn't catch. Alexandra's shoulder struck the edge of the chair behind him, pain flashing hot across his back. The second man moved in immediately, faster now, reaching for Alexandra's jacket near the collar. Alexander ducked, heart pounding, and drove his shoulder forward, not with the intention to fight but to disrupt. The contact was brief, jarring. The man stumbled back half a step, more startled than hurt. Someone barked a command in Russian, sharp but short. The third man shifted closer, cutting off Alexandra's line of escape. They still hadn't touched him properly. That was the point. This wasn't an assault meant to leave marks. It was pressure, intimidation to instill fear. Alexander could feel it closing in, the knowledge that anything they did here would be denied, reframed, or dissolved into ambiguity. "This is inappropriate," Alexander said, breath tight in his chest. "You have no authority." The first man smiled faintly, enough to signal that authority wasn't the issue. Alexander didn't wait for them to move again. He shoved the chair sideways with both hands. The metal legs scraped loudly against the floor, the sudden noise breaking the tension. That single second was enough. Alexander lunged towards the door, brushing past the man closest to it. A hand grabbed at his sleeve and missed. Another caught air inches from his shoulder. Behind him, a voice shouted, angrier and urgent. Alexander burst into the corridor and ran. His footsteps echoed wildly off the walls as he sprinted down the hall, lungs burning, mind racing. He didn't look back, he didn't need to, he already understood. This wasn't an arrest, this wasn't a mistake. It was a warning delivered carefully, without witnesses, without bruises, and without breaking the law just enough to matter. He ran until his legs screamed, then flagged down a taxi mid-turn, yanking the door open and throwing himself inside. When the taxi finally screeched to a stop, Alexander stumbled out, shaking violently. He blended into the crowd, disappearing among travelers and locals. Only then did he stop, only then did the truth settle fully. This was no longer about custody, no longer about courts or agreements. Whatever line he had crossed, it had been invisible and irreversible. His legs felt unsteady, his breath still uneven, the city spinning faintly around him. Across the street, a cafe glowed with warm yellow light, its windows fogged slightly from the heat inside. People sat close together, talking, laughing, unaware. That was what he needed. He crossed quickly and pushed through the door. Inside, the smell of coffee and baked bread hit him all at once. Alexander chose a table deep in the corner, half hidden by a tall shelf stacked with books and plants. He kept his back to the wall, eyes scanning the entrance through the reflection in the glass. Only when his hands stopped shaking enough to hold his phone did he dial Abzal's number. It rang once, twice. Abzal answered immediately, his voice alert. Alexander spoke in a low rush, recounting everything: the waiting room, the men, the way they had attacked and moved, the absence of uniforms, the pursuit. He didn't dramatize it. The facts were enough. Abzal didn't interrupt. When Alexander finished, there was a brief, heavy pause on the line. "Listen to me carefully," Abzal said at last, his tone controlled but unmistakably serious. "What happened to you didn't happen by accident. And it didn't happen without help." He didn't say police outright, but he didn't need to. "You are not safe right now, not at your apartment, not in public spaces. Stay where you are, do not move unless I tell you to. Send me your location." Alexander obeyed, fingers trembling as he dropped the pin. He asked what he should do if the men came back. Abzal told him to stay inside, choose a seat with visibility, avoid doors and windows. "Blend in," he said. "You are a tourist having coffee, nothing more." Alexander nodded even though Abzal couldn't see him. His shoulder throbbed dully now, adrenaline fading into pain. He wrapped his coat tighter around himself, forcing his breathing to slow. Abzal arrived 30 minutes later. He didn't park directly outside. He walked in calmly, scanning the room the way someone trained to notice details would. When he spotted Alexander, his expression softened just slightly. He sat across from him without greeting, placing his phone face down on the table. "You did the right thing," he said quietly. "But understand this now, what you're facing is not just Layla's family, it's influence and local protection, but we need to get out of here first." Abzal drove him to his own house instead of the apartment. It was modest, set back from the road, lights kept deliberately low. Inside, Abzal locked the door behind them and drew the curtains before doing anything else. He helped Alexander clean the scrape on his shoulder, pressed ice into his shaking hands, insisted he sit. Only then did he speak again. "You cannot stay in Kazakhstan right now," Abzal said plainly. "Not until I understand how deep this goes." Alexander stiffened. "If I leave," he said, voice hoarse, "I lose Max completely." The words came out raw and cutting. "They'll say I ran, that I abandoned him." Abzal met his gaze steadily. "No," he said. "If you stay, you might lose the chance to fight at all." He explained carefully how intimidation like this was meant to push him into a mistake, how any outburst or retaliation could be used to paint him as unstable, dangerous. "They want you emotional, exhausted, easy to discredit." Alexander shook his head, anger flaring through the fear. "So I just leave, hide," his voice cracked, "like a coward." Abzal leaned forward, like a father who wants to win, he said firmly. "This is not retreat. This is repositioning." He spoke of international custody conventions, of diplomatic channels, of strategies that required Alexander to be alive, unarrested, and legally clean. "You cannot outmuscle this system," Abzal said. "You outthink it." There was a deep, long silence settled between them. Alexander stared at his hands, replaying Max's face in court, the way his son had said, "I'll wait for you." His chest tightened painfully. Finally he bowed, but in grim understanding. Abzal placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Rest," he said. "Tomorrow we will plan it all. And when you come back, you won't be walking into the dark." The next morning was heavy on them, dark and uncertain. The light filtering through Abzal's curtains was pale and sharp, that made everything feel exposed. Alexander had barely slept. Every sound from the street had pulled him halfway awake, his body still braced for danger. Abzal noticed immediately. He poured tea without asking, slid a cup across the table, and sat opposite him with the quiet gravity of someone who had already made a decision. "You're leaving today," Abzal said. Alexander looked up. "Leaving Kazakhstan, for now," Abzal replied calmly. "You are going to Qatar." He explained that he had an old contact there, someone with reach, discretion, and experience dealing with international legal deadlocks. He can keep you safe, Abzal said. And more importantly, visible in the right places and invisible in the wrong ones. A few months, maybe less. It's time for the noise here to settle and for me to work. Alexander pushed his cup away. They win if I go. Abzal shook his head. They win if you disappear by force or by accident. He leaned forward. This is what they do. They don't arrest you, they don't threaten you openly, they frighten you into making mistakes, or they frighten you into never coming back. We won't give them either. There was a brief silence. Alexander nodded slowly, jaw tightening. Okay, he said finally, Qatar, but this isn't over. Abzal allowed himself a small, grim smile. No, he said. It's just changing shape. They left the house less than an hour later. Abzal insisted on driving. The city was already awake, traffic humming, pedestrians crowding sidewalks, Almaty unfolding in its usual way. For the first 10 minutes, everything felt almost normal. Alexander watched reflections slide across the windows, trying to convince himself this was just another drive, another day. Then Abzal spoke quietly. We're not alone. Alexander followed his gaze to the rear-view mirror. A dark sedan had been behind them for several blocks now, keeping a careful distance. When Abzal changed lanes, it changed too, smooth and practiced. A second car appeared moments later, merging behind the first. They just want you scared, Abzal said evenly. As if on cue, the first car surged forward, pulling alongside them. The driver didn't look over. The message was in the proximity, the inches between metal and metal at 60 kilometers an hour. Abzal tightened his grip on the wheel. The street narrowed ahead, funneling them into a maze of side roads lined with shops, parked cars, delivery trucks. Abzal turned sharply without signaling. The sedan followed. Another car cut in from the opposite direction, forcing Abzal to brake hard. Tires screeched on the streets, horns blaring hard. Alexandra's heart slammed violently against his ribs. They're hurting us, Abzal said. Classic. The sedan accelerated, edging closer, its bumper nearly touching theirs. Another sharp turn that almost made them shudder. A cyclist swerved out of the way, shouting. Abzal didn't slow. He drove with precision, threading through gaps that felt impossibly tight, mirrors missing obstacles by centimeters. Alexander gripped the door handle, breath shallow, adrenaline roaring in his ears. The second car tried to box them in. Abzal slammed the accelerator, darting into oncoming traffic for a split second before cutting back into their lane. A bus roared past, missing them by inches. Alexander let out a sharp gasp. They want an accident, Abzal said, voice still controlled, something that looks tragic and unavoidable. The road opened suddenly onto a wider stretch leading towards the airport. Abzal swerved across lanes, forcing the trailing car to hesitate. The sedan fell back just slightly. Abzal took the opportunity, pushing the car hard, engines screaming as the terminal signs came into view. Security barriers loomed ahead, traffic thickened. There were guards and cameras all over. The sedan slowed. Abzal exhaled slowly, easing off the accelerator as they merged into airport traffic. The pursuing cars peeled away one by one, disappearing into the city as if they had never been there at all. They parked near the departure terminal. For a moment, neither of them moved. Alexandra's hands were shaking now, the reality of what had just happened crashing down on him. He looked at Abzal. This isn't making any sense anymore, he said quietly. Abzal shook. No, he replied, it's about survival, which means we stop reacting and start playing. They got out of the car. The airport buzzed with life, announcements echoing, luggage wheels rattling, travelers rushing past. At the entrance, Abzal paused, placing a firm hand on Alexandra's shoulder. Let them think they scared you away, he said. Let them think this worked. Alexander looked back once, towards the city he was leaving behind, towards his son. His chest ached, but beneath the fear something harder was forming, resolve. I'll be back, he said. Abzal acquiesced. This isn't over yet.